Human attention is a phenomenon layered with contradiction, complexity, and instinctual chaos beneath the surface of social interaction. It is not a simple on-off switch where presence equates to care and absence equates to indifference. It operates more like a finely tuned balance mechanism within the human psyche, forever seeking equilibrium between exposure and concealment. When someone is obsessed with you, particularly in the psychological sense, their internal experience of that obsession may not align with the external behavior you observe. You expect proximity, but what you witness is retreat. You expect pursuit, but what unfolds is silence. Obsession generates a psychological overload. It floods the mind with intrusive thoughts, a preoccupation that refuses to dissipate through mere willpower. To feel obsessed is to experience the mind gripping onto a single point of focus with such ferocity that normal function begins to deteriorate. This emotional turbulence creates tension that demands release, and one of the primary ways the human nervous system releases overwhelming stimuli is through withdrawal, through shutting down engagement. Ignoring becomes not an absence of attention, but a symptom of too much attention concentrated in secret. When the nervous system is overwhelmed, it seeks control. One way to regain control over something that feels too intense is to deny oneself access to it. Think of a person recovering from an addiction. The very thing they crave becomes the thing they must avoid. The same psychological mechanics apply to obsession. The object of obsession becomes an emotional stimulant, a trigger for vulnerability, and so distance is manufactured as a self-regulatory mechanism. This is not merely a matter of avoidance out of indifference. It is avoidance born out of hyper-focus. There is a phrase in psychodynamics, what you avoid most is often what you desire most deeply. This is not poetic rhetoric. It is grounded in decades of clinical observation. An individual drowning in preoccupation with another person may instinctively step back, not because they want less, but because they want so much it threatens to destabilize their internal order. Social mammals, including humans, instinctively balance approach and avoidance in relationships. Too much approach feels suffocating. Too much avoidance feels isolating. The mechanism works like a pendulum swinging between connection and self-preservation. When obsession tips the balance, the pendulum swings hard toward avoidance, not because there is no desire to connect, but because the cost of connection feels unbearable. Emotional safety is sought through silence. Ignoring, in this context, functions as a psychological defense. It becomes a fortress built to contain feelings that are perceived as dangerous, as disruptive. Silence is the wall, and obsession is the storm on the other side of it. That storm rages internally, not externally. And so from the outside, all that is seen is the fortress, closed doors, unanswered messages, missed glances. Yet within, the storm intensifies. The mind is a pattern-seeking machine, and when it becomes locked onto a particular pattern, whether that's a person's voice, presence, or image, it can enter a loop that feels impossible to escape. When obsession sets in, attention narrows like a laser. But unlike physical lasers that burn outward, psychological lasers can burn inward, consuming the person from within. Ignoring becomes a desperate attempt to widen that focus again, to break free from the suffocating loop. Obsession is inherently destabilizing because it creates an imbalance in perceived agency. When someone feels obsessed, they often feel controlled by external forces, by the presence, absence, or behavior of the person they fixate on. This loss of agency is terrifying, especially to individuals who value self-mastery. Therefore, ignoring is not an act of detachment. It is an act of reclaiming autonomy. It is a self-imposed exile meant to restore the feeling of inner governance. Imagine this dynamic in evolutionary terms. In ancestral environments, social bonds were a matter of survival, yet too much dependence on a single person could be dangerous. If that person disappeared, the emotional fallout could impair survival strategies. Evolution has shaped us to develop psychological self-correction mechanisms, such as withdrawal in the face of overwhelming attachment. Ignoring is not a flaw. It is a feature embedded into the fabric of human emotional regulation. Even at the neurological level, the brain's reward systems complicate matters. The dopamine circuits that light up in the brain during moments of social engagement with a desired individual are the same circuits involved in addiction. And just as addicts may go through cycles of binging and withdrawal, so too do people locked in cycles of relational obsession. Ignoring mirrors withdrawal symptoms. It is the mind stepping back to recalibrate its chemistry, attempting to return to baseline levels of arousal and focus. From a philosophical perspective, this phenomenon touches on the nature of freedom and constraint within human relationships. True freedom in human connection comes not from constant availability, but from the ability to regulate one's own need for another person. Ignoring becomes a tool for reestablishing freedom, not from the person themselves, but from the grip that obsession has over one's own mind. This is why, in many therapeutic settings, avoidance behaviors are not always treated as purely negative. They are often seen as signals, red flags that deeper emotional currents are at work. Silence in obsession is a paradoxical cry for balance. It is not the cold silence of apathy, but the hot silence of internal struggle. When someone ignores you while being obsessed with you, it is not the absence of emotional energy. It is the redirection of that energy inward toward maintaining psychological survival. Rather, an invitation to look beyond surface-level interpretations, to develop a more refined understanding of the psychological mechanisms that govern human connection and disconnection alike. In every moment of silence, there may be a world of noise concealed just beneath the surface, waiting to be understood. Human beings are wired for connection, yet paradoxically, they often pull away from the very thing they crave most. Psychological defense mechanisms are not deliberate choices, but deeply ingrained survival strategies developed over years of experience, layered into the architecture of the mind like sediment under pressure. When someone is overwhelmed by obsession, when their thoughts circle endlessly around another person, the mind instinctively searches for relief from that intensity. And one of the most immediate forms of psychological self-defense is to ignore the source of that emotional flood. No one enjoys feeling controlled by invisible forces, and yet obsession has that very effect. It hijacks thought, warps perception, consumes time and mental energy that could be used elsewhere. Psychological defense mechanisms activate in moments when that mental hijacking becomes intolerable, when the self begins to fracture under the weight of unwanted dependency. Ignoring, then, is not about rejecting another person, but about reclaiming lost psychological territory, an act of inner conservation. Human beings naturally seek patterns, but obsession distorts those patterns into loops that never resolve. The same face, the same voice, the same memories play on repeat. Defense mechanisms arise precisely to break these loops, even if temporarily. Ignoring interrupts the cycle, offering a psychological reset button. Silence becomes the only available weapon against the repetitive nature of obsessive thought. For individuals who pride themselves on autonomy and strength, realizing they are obsessed can feel like a form of self-betrayal. The instinctive response is not to lean deeper into that attachment, but to cut it off, to sever all visible ties in order to mask the internal struggle. Ignoring becomes a shield against perceived weakness, a deliberate masking of inner vulnerability through outward detachment. From a neurobiological standpoint, the brain's stress response system cannot sustain obsession indefinitely without damage. Cortisol levels rise, sleep patterns break down, concentration on other tasks diminishes. Defense mechanisms like ignoring kick in as a neurological necessity, an emergency brake pulling the mind back from psychological freefall. This is not calculated cruelty, it is an act of inner preservation dictated by biology. In many cases, ignoring someone you are obsessed with functions as an attempt to regain dignity. The mind recognizes its own subjugation to desire and responds by asserting dominance in the only way it can, through withdrawal. Ignoring becomes an assertion of self-worth, not because there is no value in the object of obsession, but because there is too much perceived loss in remaining enslaved to that fixation. Peace psychological defense mechanisms operate on a level deeper than conscious thought. By the time someone realizes they are ignoring someone they can't stop thinking about, the mechanism has already activated itself. It is a reflex born from years of learned behavior, social conditioning, and primal instinct. It is not always logical, but it is always purposeful in its design to protect the integrity of the self. When obsession crosses the line from healthy attraction to dangerous preoccupation, Defense mechanisms step in as regulators, enforcing boundaries the conscious mind may no longer be able to maintain on its own. Ignoring is one of the cleanest, simplest forms of this regulation, a total shutdown of communication in service of psychological rebalancing. Imagine obsession as a flame burning too hot. Ignoring is the act of turning off the oxygen supply. The fire cannot sustain itself without constant fuel, and silence denies it that fuel. This is not merely symbolic. The mind's emotional circuitry responds directly to the cessation of stimulus. Where there was once obsession, there is now absence. And that absence is what allows the system to recalibrate.